Are you ready to kick off the 2025 Block of the Month party with me? Whether you're brand new to quilting or a seasoned pro who just loves making stunning blocks, this program is for you. In this video, I'm showing you how to create this month's January block using the 4 at a time flying geese method. It's efficient, fun, and oh so satisfying. Plus, I'll be sharing a few bonus tips along the way to boost your confidence and ensure your geese are looking sharp. Trust me, you're going to want to see how this block comes together as part of this quilt. So let's get started. Welcome to the January block pattern. Each pattern will follow the same format and structure, so I want to take a moment to highlight a few key things that will help you as we go through the year. With this quilt, you can make it with scraps, pre-cuts, or yardage, whatever works best for you. But if you're working with yardage, be sure to check out the section on page 2 each month. This is where you'll find exactly what width of fabric cuts to make from your yardage. If you don't use the entire strip that month, save the remainder for the months ahead. The instructions will let you know when it is time to make a new width of fabric cut. The second thing I want to point out is that we're using 8 fabrics of color for the entire quilt, plus the background fabric. However, not all of these fabrics will be used every month. And third, if you're working from scraps, you'll want to skip straight to the piece count column in the cutting instructions. This will show you exactly what pieces to cut from each fabric. If you're using pre-cuts though, focus on the left column of the cutting instructions. You'll find the smallest pre-cut size needed, like F8, which stands for fat eighth for example. It'll tell you the minimum size needed for those pieces. I hope this is clear, but if you have any questions about fabric uses for this quilt, don't hesitate to ask. As we move through the quilt, especially in later months, you'll encounter some smaller pieces that add a lot of detail and charm to the design of the entire quilt. My top recommendation is to starch all of your fabric before you start cutting and piecing. And here's how I do it. Since I'm working with scraps, my fabric pieces can get a bit crinkled because of the way I store them. Go ahead and spray the fabric generously with the starch to dampen it. And don't be shy, you can't really overdo it. Then press it dry. When the fabric is dry, it'll feel a little stiffer, but it'll be much easier to work with. While starching is totally optional, and believe me, I've made several quilts without starching my fabrics, I do believe it'll help you a lot with accuracy in piecing this quilt. So I will encourage you to give it a try each month, but don't feel like you have to use it at all either. Here I've gone ahead and cut out all of my pieces. This month we're learning to make 4 at a time flying geese. For this method you will need 1 larger square and 4 smaller squares. And for this block you'll need 1 5.5 inch square of background fabric and 4 3-inch squares, each with a diagonal line drawn on the back. I've already prepped mine. And following the pattern instructions, I'll start by placing 2 of the smaller squares right sides together onto the larger square. You'll notice the smaller squares overlap slightly in the middle, but don't worry, that's how that's supposed to be. Just make sure the diagonal line meets in the middle, and then take your unit to your sewing machine and sew a 1/4 inch seam on both sides of the diagonal line. I have my unit here at the sewing machine, but before I start sewing, I want to show you something that would make a great habit if you choose to adopt it. I always sew with a fabric pleater, which is a small piece of scrap fabric. I've already used this one several times and that's totally okay. And before I sew anything with my machine, I like to put the leader through first to give the needle some ups and downs to connect with the bobbin thread. When I first started sewing a few years ago, I had noticed that whenever I put something under the needle that especially had an angle with a point, the machine liked to eat it up. And I found that simply sending something square through first helped avoid that. So here's my first 1/4 inch seam going along the right side of the line. And here's the center of the unit where the 2 smaller squares overlap, but I'm going to keep on going. Once I'm done sewing the first seam, I'll take it out and rotate it to sew another, but before I do that, I'll run my leader through again. We are finished sewing these 2 seams, so I'll take this unit back to the cutting mat. Now that I have a seam on both sides of the diagonal line, it is time to cut along that line so that we separate it into 2 parts. Before I do that, I usually like to press the units flat to give the stitches a chance to settle, and when it's flatter, it'll make the unit easier to cut as well. I think it looks a little flatter now, so next I'm going to set my ruler along that line that I drew, and I'll cut along that line to separate it into 2 parts. Press the new triangle flaps open by opening them with your finger first. I like to guide the iron with my finger first by opening and feeling the seam before pressing my iron gently over it. Now we have 2 of these heart-shaped units, and it's time to take the remaining 2 smaller squares with the diagonal lines, place them right sides together with a unit, and line them up along the bottom corner of the heart units. Then take these 2 units to the sewing machine and sew a 1/4 inch seam on both sides of these diagonal lines again, on both of these units. I'm back from the sewing machine with 2 units and seams on both sides. Before I cut along these lines, again, I'm going to press the units flat first. I usually just press it for just a second, and I'm not rough at all. I'm really literally pressing, and you'll see when I'm done that it sits much flatter now. So go ahead and cut along the lines to divide these in half again and make them into flying geese units. Here are the 4 units, and now we just need to press the new triangle corners open, and I'll be back after doing that. Here we have 4 flying geese, but they are not ready for piecing yet because they need to be trimmed down to exactly 4.5 inches by 2.5 inches according to the pattern. If we do not trim them at this point, they will not have nice corners and they will make your block look a little skewed if you keep moving on. Now let's take a look at my ruler. Please note that I'm a left-handed cutter, so I hope the information I provide here can be translated to the way you typically like to cut if you're right-handed. The main idea is that we want to make sure at this point at the top of the triangle needs to be a 1/4 inch away from the edge. Do not trim up to this point because if you do, you will lose that point when you sew this edge with another piece with a 1/4 inch seam. So having that 1/4 inch of space from the edge allows the point to appear in the block after you've sewn it together with a 1/4 inch seam. Next, we want to make sure that the triangle point is centered along its edge. Since this edge will be trimmed at 4.5 inches, we want this point to line up with the halfway mark, which is 2.25 inches away from the top edge of the ruler and a 1/4 inch in from the side of the ruler. So I'm essentially looking for the 2.25 mark that is a 1/4 inch from this long edge. For me, that will be the tip of this white line here because it's a 1/4 inch in from the side and it is 2.25 inches from the top. I will also look at the 2.5 inch mark at the top to make sure the diagonal seams meet at that corner. With all that said, let me bring this all up close where you can see. The diagonal seam is hitting that 2.5 inch corner. The top right triangle point hits the 2.25 mark that is a 1/4 inch away from the long edge, and the diagonal seam down here should also match this bottom 2.5 inch corner. I look for all of these points before I go ahead and trim along the side and the top. After I do that, I will rotate to trim the other 2 edges, and I will mainly look at the 2.5 inch line to line up the side and the 4.5 inch bottom line. You will still see that the triangle tip is a 1/4 inch away from the edge, and if you look closely, it should be 2.25 inches away from the top edge. At this point, everything under the ruler here is 2.5 by 4.5 inch flying geese that we want. If you were to piece this flying geese without trimming off this fabric, your block would come out uneven. And now that I've trimmed all 4 edges, this is a perfectly trimmed 4.5 inch by 2.5 inch flying geese, where the triangle point is 2.25 inches away from both sides and a 1/4 inch away from the top. When you go to piece this with the other pieces in the block, you will end up with really nice points. At this time, I'm on page 5 of the pattern, and I want you to see that steps 1, 2, and 3 have diagrams with arrows showing recommended seam directions for pressing. If you like to press open all the time, or if you have your own preferences for pressing, go for it. I just want to share that the suggestions are there if they were to lead you to the nesting of seams in later steps. For example, if these outer rows were pressed outside from the middle background fabric, you can see that I've pressed these seams away from the center. But when it comes to the middle row, I press them towards the center. I also chose it this way because my background fabric squares in this block tend to be of a lighter color, which means that if we press more of the fabric towards the darker fabrics, your seams are less likely to be seen when the whole quilt is finished. So if the seams in these rows are pressed in opposite directions, you'll notice that when you place them right sides together before you sew them at the machine, you'll feel the seams nesting together at the points when they start going in opposite directions. The nesting of these seams lead to the making of really nice points if you choose to follow my pressing suggestions. Alright, now this is what the unit looks like with the seams all nested in the back. You'll see that these are outside and inside, and it leads to really nice points in the front. But when I go to press the new seams that I just created, I like to press them open because with the seams going in one direction already, if I were to choose one side, I feel like the amount of fabric going on top of each other would get really bulky. So at this point, I do recommend pressing open. In order to do that, I first like to open the seam with my finger and then follow it with my iron. Gently run my iron over it, leading by my finger. Now this should be unit 1, all finished and ready for block assembly instructions. Alright, so here I'm going to show you in action the reason why we leave that triangle point of the flying geese a 1/4 inch away from the edge now that it's time to piece it into the block. When we start sewing and we place the flying geese unit right sides together with its counterpart, I usually like to sew with the flying geese unit on top so that I can have a view of the intersection of seams that happens right at the tip of the triangle over here. That way when I go to sew at the machine, I want my 1/4 inch seam to go right through that intersection of seams. Here's my unit all sewn up, and you can see that when I sewed this 1/4 inch seam on this side of the unit, I made sure that the stitches intersected this intersection of seams at the top of the flying geese triangle point. And when you go to press it open, you'll always have a nice point in your block made by your perfectly trimmed flying geese. And that's it! We've completed our first block together. I hope you'd enjoyed this tutorial and that it's giving you the confidence in making flying geese. With this practice, you'll be ready to tackle flying geese anytime, and they are sure coming your way this year. Enjoy!